Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of the Strength Coach Roundtable podcast right here on Row Perfect UK's Rowing Chat Network. Today I'm joined once again by Blake Gourlay and Joe DeLeo, my fellow rowing strength coaches, and we're going to talk about the squat. First, this is an exciting roundtable podcast for us, not just because we are finally back together again after a few month layoff, but also because we've got some exciting new opportunities for you, our listeners. We've rolled out a Facebook group to discuss strength training for rowing. It's going to be linked to through the Row Perfect UK Facebook page as well, but you can find that at facebook.com/groups/strength coach roundtable. Right now, it's just the four of us, Blake, Joe, me, with Rebecca from Row Perfect as an admin. But we hope to have many of you joining us soon. So we hope that this is going to be a good place for discussion of strength training for rowing. We also have a web page now on rowperfect.co.uk under the podcast menu so that you can find old episodes and our show notes and stuff a little bit more easily. So we're trying to streamline this a little bit and help make it easier for our audience to find our content and to get a hold of us. Ultimately, we got into this for coach education. We love the Row Perfect mission of spreading rowing education. So we want to be accessible and get to know you all and help solve your strength training needs for rowing better. Before we get into the squat, since it's been a couple months, let's go ahead and go around the horn and update us on briefly what you've been doing in coaching or education or whatever. Blake, why don't you go first?
Sure. Been lucky enough to complete my master's recently, so happy to be done with that. And I'm still coaching. I've been coaching as a novice men's coach for the last 5 years, and I actually got the opportunity to be the varsity men's coach now. So that's my new position, what's keeping me mostly busy, and then of course my business on the side as well.
Congrats. Joe, what's new with you?
Blake, congratulations on finishing your master's. That's awesome. What's new with me? Relocated from Providence, Rhode Island to Kansas City, Missouri. So we got here in the beginning of August and started a brand new job. So I've been very fortunate to find a full-time strength and conditioning coaching job at Lawrence Memorial Hospital Performance and Wellness Center. So I am working inside a 4,000 square foot facility next to 2 full-time physical therapists and coaching elementary to high school athletes of all different sports every day.
Very cool. Yeah, for me, I'm a little bit over halfway through my master's program right now, but otherwise just strength coaching still for the Western Washington University team. The varsity weight room's just gotten remodeled. So we've got an all new Sorinex everything facility with reverse hypers and GHR combos and power racks and the whole deal. Full access to kettlebells and all sorts of stuff. So that's been an awesome opportunity to get to expand my work with that team a little bit. And then, yeah, otherwise, same thing, just writing and trying to get new videos and stuff out around the grad school thing. I guess I'll be the last one done of the trio. So that should be happening sometime next spring. So let's go ahead and get into the squat. Last time we talked about the deadlift and we did a deep dive into that. This time we're going to do something similar for the squat. So we'll talk about how we teach it, what our teaching progressions are, what things we look for in terms of readiness to move through those progressions, what variations we like for rowing, because it's not all about the barbell back squat, which is what most people kind of traditionally think of, as well as programming for in-season and out of season. Now, Joe, I think you said that you wanted to really start from the ground up and go through how you do foot positioning. So why don't you go ahead and start with that, and then we'll work our way up the kinetic chain from there.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm excited to kind of take point and share this. So one of the keys, regardless of whatever modality you're going to start with, is determining your foot position and how to do that. So if you have the opportunity to get an evaluation FMS done, that's always a great starting point. If not, you can get a hip scour done So that's something I learned during the Stuart McGill seminar. But basically, the individual lays on their back, and you're just holding their calf and their foot, and then gently kind of moving up the knee towards the chest, and just kind of finding where they can place the knee either inside the shoulder or outside the shoulder to find that deepest position. So that allows you to kind of see where they're going to be set up from with both feet on the ground. So from there, the next step would be to do a pelvic rock test. And you get into a modified quadruped position with the knees together. And you're going to have wrist, elbow, shoulder stacked. And you're going to rock slowly, bringing the hips towards the heels. And what you're looking for is the breaking point at the lumbopelvic hip complex. Does the pelvis begin to change positions and tuck underneath? And are you starting to see some lumbar flexion? And you kind of make a note of how far they're able to go. They come back up, reestablish that neutral spine position, and then go about 2 fists width distance between the knees. So they go a little bit wider, and then again, rock the hips towards the ankles and see if they can get any deeper without losing that change in spinal position. So you repeat this over and over again to establish how far out or how wide you should be going with the knees. And then that's where your feet are going to be. So once you establish that ideal depth, there's no change in pelvis position. You'll have that individual stand up, and then depending on whatever variation you want to start with, you've kind of established at least the width portion. And then from there, figuring out how much toe out they should do. I usually have the individual start with their feet kind of straight ahead on railroad tracks and squat down, and I'll watch their feet move. And then I'll just, suggest that they turn their feet out, 20 to 30 degrees, and ask them if that feels more comfortable. And that's what I'm usually looking for there. So those are just some quick starters for everybody to get started on how to set their feet. And that's going to be a big impact on the squat, because your hip structure is going to play a big part in what is kind of the ideal foot position. So the angle of the femoral neck, the head of the femur, and the depth of your pelvis, or how deep that socket is going to play a big part in how wide you need to go, as well as how much cant or how much toe out you need. So those are some quick starting points to establish foot position.
So, yeah, and as a pertinent reminder for our audience, the English language is often imperfect in terms of describing adequately these motions and kind of complex adjustments that we're making while the athlete's lifting or while we're coaching. So we do show notes that get posted to Row Perfect's blog after every episode, and that'll enable Joe to put some videos or some links there too. I'd imagine that McGill has a resource on that or something. So if you had a hard time visualizing all of that, we can hopefully provide some help there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely have that up in the show notes for everyone.
And one thing that you made me think of too while you were talking was when we announced that this was going to be the topic, Dr. Fiona Wilson, a back specialist and rowing researcher, commented, you'll be going nice and deep on those squats, right? And my response was nice and deep so long as it's supported by the torso, and that depth is not just achieved for the sake of depth by rounding out the pelvis. So I thought that was an interesting point that you made about trying to find that point where you can maintain, or you can get as deep as possible while maintaining a neutral pelvis, is a real key to doing the squat safely and effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a huge key, because you don't want the spine to be changing position while it's under a load, right? And that's what we're trying to establish there, how you can get there unloaded, body weight only, establishing that foot position. And then, we have that lined up before we start adding weight. So that's a good just precursor for everybody.
And it's a good key for carryover to rowing too, because if ideally at the bottom of the squat, you're going to be in a very similar position to the catch, and that's what we're trying to do is develop, sport specific power to really get good leg drive and connection off the catch. But you can't do that if your seat is tucked under you at the catch, just the same way that you can't do that in a squat if your pelvis is tucked under you at the bottom.
Spot on, man. Couldn't have said it any better.
Blake, what do you have for us on teaching progressions for the squat? Do you like to go straight to the bilateral, or where does your approach differ from Joe's?
So I'll always start with an FMS, functional movement screen. And to be honest, most of the athletes that I get score a 1, and a 1 means it's dysfunctional. So it's not ready to load until the movement looks a little bit better. And, there's all sorts of reasons for why it's not ready to load. But if it is ready to load, I really just kind of go between bilateral and single leg. So bilateral, I really go into goblet squats until it's kind of exhausted. It exhausts the weight that we can load the guy with. And then from there, I'll go to a front squat. But most of the time, I'm mostly doing goblet squats for my bilateral. And I do a lot of single leg work. So split squats, lunges, rear foot elevated split squats, also known as like Bulgarian split squats, and single leg squats. Those are all the variations I use.
And so I know you're not with Santa Clara anymore, but did you find that your college athletes there were equally unable to squat as your junior athletes? I mean, the FMS is a scale of 1 to what?
So FMS is actually 0 to 3. 0 is if there's pain. 1 is if there's a dysfunction. 2 is passing. That's really all you need. And then 3 is like perfect. So yeah, I mean, across the board, clients, high school, college athletes, squats tend to be really poor. And that depends on the individual of why it actually is poor. But a lot of times it seems to come down to ankles, sometimes hips, but sometimes it's also just a stability problem and an inability to like know how and when to create tension.
I find that the majority of my college guys are able to get there, but like you, I think a lot of them, or like your clients, a lot of them kind of struggle with that initially as well, with having the right range of motion. So kind of, I think I'm somewhere between you guys. I generally start with the body weight squat, and I kind of like to just see what they can naturally do. So I'll just say, hey, let's just go ahead and do a body weight squat. Show me what you think that's going to look like, and then I'll make adjustments from there. Joe, I'll be interested to see your approach. I'm always trying to improve, obviously, but I'll be interested to see that kind of manifested in video from going really from the ground up. Once that I'm satisfied with their body weight squat technique, it's kind of the same thing. I'm adjusting knee position and foot position and how wide they're going. I have a video of this as well. One of the things on my website is my How to Train Your Rower series, where I have videos from me coaching my athletes in the squat, deadlift, and overhead press. So if you're interested, you can check out. That's my whole basically teaching process for going right to the barbell front squat. But that's my progression is body weight squat to Blake. I love the goblet squat as well. And then once you're good enough at the goblet squat, then we can move on to the front squat. And as far as the teaching progression goes, the main thing that I try to work on is finding that right hip rhythm of not doing the motion too much with the hips and just kind of pushing the hips back endlessly, but also not shooting the knees forward right away either and not having really any motion at the hip. So trying to get the athlete to kind of find that right point between unlocking the hips and sitting straight down in a good pelvis supported position.
So two things. One is just wanted to back up before I touch on the variation. So one thing I forgot on the kind of the setup, and somebody asked on Facebook about this, so I wanted to make sure we addressed it. They asked about squatting with shoes, or barefoot. So ideally, if your gym or your training facility allows you to be in barefoot or sock, that's great. You're going to get a lot more feedback, proprioception, sensory rich environment. If you have to wear shoes, try to go something minimalistic, like a Vibram or a Converse Chuck Taylor. But most of the shoes out there now are going to have a lot more padding in the heel area, and so that's really going to shift center of gravity onto the ball of the foot. So when you're doing stuff like squats, deadlifts, or kettlebell swings, it's going to affect the center of mass and make it difficult for you to feel comfortable and kind of execute the movement well. So that's something to keep in mind.
Are you anti Olympic lifting shoe? The Olympic lifting shoe for our audience is generally a 3/4 inch raised heel, but it's solid, not compressible like you would find an athletic training shoe.
No, I mean, that's a totally different. Olympic lifting is a sport in and of itself, and that's the similar type of shoe I believe they use for gear voice sport or kettlebell sport. So, not against it. It has its place and purpose, but ideally, if they can use or be barefoot, I think that's great, because as Blake touched on, ankle mobility is a huge limiting factor in high school and college athletes. So getting them to kind of address that and work on that, doing prying goblet squats, spending a little bit more time sitting in the bottom of the squat position, really working on thoracic extension and prying the hips open and allowing the hip capsule, posterior hip capsule to open up, as well as working on ankle dorsiflexion is huge.
Blake, how about you? What's your preferred footwear for your athletes?
Definitely depends on the environment. For my clients, I'm mostly in like a turfed setting, so everything's soft and safe. And if they're comfortable with it, I'll go shoes off. I do agree with Joe. Like, you get a lot more feedback, and you're actually working motion into all the joints in the foot, which they rarely get that motion. And eventually that will start to open up ankle mobility. And I've also seen people who just haven't squatted well or moved well in shoes, and you take the shoes off and all of a sudden that movement improves. So I'm definitely a fan of it, but there's some situations where it's not the best setting. But if you drop a weight on your shoe versus your foot, you're going to get the same damage no matter what.
Yeah, I've never bought that as a reason. I mean, as long as you're not squatting in, I don't know, an environment with a lot of rusty nails or, some sort of tetanus risk, it basically seems equivalent in terms of safety to be in a shoe versus not in a shoe.
Yeah, and for me, it's a comfort thing too. Some people just don't like to take their shoes off.
Yeah.
So I'll let them lift in what they want to lift as long as it's not causing harm.
I will say I am pro Olympic lifting shoe as a general rule. Not all of my athletes. I think there's only a handful of my guys who use them because they've purchased them on their own or whatever. You can get them now. They're a lot more accessible than they used to be. But for between $100 and $150, Adidas and Nike both have a version of it. I like it because it somewhat mitigates that ankle mobility impingement that's very common. I see the same thing as you, Blake, with restricted ankle range of motion. Using the Olympic shoe doesn't like, the right thing to do is not to say, okay, well, I'll just use the shoe and avoid fixing my ankle mobility. But the best path that I found is to use the shoe and also address the ankle mobility. That way the athlete can still squat in a supported position. And if you want to try at home just to basically see if this will make a difference, take one of the 2.5 or the 5-pound plates, put one under each heel, and then squat. And you're essentially getting that 3/4 inch raise. Then in addition, Joe, I loved what you said about racking up time, and that it's often called the third world squat or whatever, the deep squat position, where you're basically just sitting down as low as you can go, pressure through the heels. My high school coach used to have us like try to rack up as much time as possible there. In high school, I used to brush my teeth from sitting in the deep squat position. Just spending more time in that full compression can really help. But in addition, I have found that the Olympic shoe is a useful tool for those athletes who might struggle with that.
Yeah, that's a great point. One other thing to touch on there too is just kind of working on like some of the beginning variations. The goblet squat's fantastic, but playing with the variation of that is doing a face the wall squat a la goblet. So, getting less than 6 to 8 inches from a wall facing it and squatting down, it forces you to stay very upright. So you can really work on that good thoracic extension. So, translating that over to good, strong posture, an ideal catch position in the boat. And again, addressing the hip and ankle mobility. That's something to kind of work on at the beginning before you really start kind of training it for the strength purpose.
Yeah, and sorry, Blake, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before we move on a little bit?
No, go ahead. You got it.
Okay. I was going to say, I don't use the back squat much at all. And it's specifically for what you just touched on of it's so much easier for athletes to compensate for lower body range of motion basically by doing it with their thoracic spine and bending really far forward at the torso to make that work. I especially am against using the low bar squat in rowing with generally then the bar set down on kind of the back of the shoulder rather than right on top of the traps. It usually also involves that wider stance that just doesn't apply. So as far as variations go, for multiple reasons, carryover as well as safety, I like that goblet squat and the front squat and that face the wall drill, which we'll definitely get a link to in the show notes for emphasizing that upright torso and not really even providing the option for athletes to cheat that by using their lumbar spine or entirely on the hips.
Yeah, and that's go ahead, Blake. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the goblet squat and the front squat also just not only encourage that posture, but it also turns the core on quite a bit more than a back squat. And the load's different and it's a little bit safer on the spine. And we've talked about how, you can look at a lift on land and you can see how that person's going to row on the water. That athlete that, excuse me, that athlete that can't hold that upright posture, they're probably collapsing into their catch over and over and over again. So that's why it's also valuable to get them to move well on land.
It's a great indicator, yeah. And you interned with Mike Boyle, right? And I know he's a big front and goblet squat guy too, right?
Oh yeah, I stole all this from him for sure.
Joe, what you got?
No, that's great. The only thing I was going to add there is just that one of the reasons I like doing the face the wall squat drill is that besides the inherent physical benefits, from like a coaching / learning perspective, you don't have to do as much verbal cueing with the person. They're getting direct feedback. And that's what you kind of want them to build in is that, developing the athleticism, developing the awareness. So it's like, okay, well, I can't go any deeper because my head's going to, bump into the wall in front of me. So I have to, stay, and get good thoracic extension. So having that kind of situation, using the environment to provide that feedback rather than us, it's just another way for the athlete to kind of learn how to do those things on their own. And that can translate much better to them doing it in the boat.
Yeah, that's been one of the big things I've learned so far in my master's program at the University of Denver is that getting the athlete to learn things instead of putting them in environments where we tell them things. So if you could put them in a wall squat drill or something that doesn't allow them to get that torso bend, that's much more effective than just telling them, hey, don't bend your torso so far forward. It's a little bit, I don't know if you guys have read The Inner Game of Tennis, but that's kind of his idea is to learn it through doing rather than through telling. Sounds like we are mostly in agreement on goblet squat and front squat being our two main favorite variations squatting for rowing. Are there situations where you would use a back squat? And if not, what? I know, Blake, you touched on the rear foot elevated squat, but what other squats do you guys like to use? Blake?
Yeah, I rarely ever get to back squat or program it. I can't actually think of a situation where I would. I'd rather exhaust the front squat. And then, yeah, I do a lot of single leg work. So we'll start with split squats, then we'll turn it into stepping. So we'll go lunges, and then we'll go to the rear foot elevated split squat. And then I'll usually sprinkle in some single leg squats as well. but you can end up loading those up like pretty heavy, and they can move pretty well, and they can get very strong there. And I think a lot of times people think rowing is a symmetrical sport, but it's really kind of asymmetrical, and one leg pushes off a little bit more than the other, and whether or not that's supposed to be that way or not, doing single leg work helps actually balance it out. So I tend to do more single leg than bilateral.
Yeah, I agree with both you guys. Big fan of the goblet and the front squat. Using either a single or double kettlebell front squats are great. The single kettlebell front squat's a great variation because you're kind of overloading one side. So it places a little bit more demand on the core to stay upright and not kind of lean side to side. So that's great to address some of the asymmetries that Blake mentioned there. And then loading up with two bells, you can really work on kind of top end maximum strength. And all the progressions Blake mentioned in terms of single leg, use those, love them. Probably the only one I'd add in there, and it's more of an advanced exercise. Very few people I've worked with have been able to get there, is the pistol. But that's a fun one if you can do it.
And if you could do it, you might have a career in gymnastics once you're tired of rowing. One of the things, I mean, you guys both touched on the asymmetries that develop through rowing. I love using the single leg squat, and what I'll have my athletes do is do their weaker leg first, and then do no more than match the reps on their stronger leg. So let's say I've got a port side or a stroke side athlete. Usually I've found that the inside leg tends to be stronger. I'll be interested to see if that's your if that's your experience as well. But so if their right leg is stronger, they'll do a rear foot elevated or a single leg squat with their left leg first, see how many reps they can get on that side, and then match that with their right side. That way we're still providing some stimulus to the right leg, but we're not then going all out on the right leg and kind of making that imbalance even worse through loading.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think that's a good idea in almost every form of training, not just squatting. I did want to point out that I think a lot of people see the squat as only squatting with two legs, but we're also talking about single leg variations here, because it's still a squatting motion. It's just a different variation, and sometimes people aren't safely able to like heavily load a front squat, but you still want to load that pattern, and single leg is usually a good option there.
Plenty of ways to get strong for sure, and that's one problem. I'll often rail online against the kind of the starting strength model, which is the 3x5 or the 5x5 linear progression on barbell, back squat, deadlift, bench press, kind of like super minimal exercise selection that just doesn't have any place in rowing, and especially not when you're working with a team of athletes. There's so many more demands in rowing than there are in something like powerlifting, and so many more biomechanical stuff that we've got to work around. So really, finding the right variation for the athlete and where they're at from a physical preparedness standpoint. Joe, inside leg or outside leg, and other thoughts on that?
No, you're spot on. I mean, that's what I found kind of across the board. Sweep rower, inside leg is usually much stronger, much more dominant. So they need to do a little bit more work. So I use kind of a similar standpoint in terms of trying to balance that out from a strength symmetry standpoint. So usually starting with the weaker leg first and doing extra repetitions or no more than the same number of reps on the dominant side, just to balance that out.
Cool. So yeah, let's go ahead and wrap this up then with a discussion on programming. Heavy all year round, right? Maxes all the time. No. What do you do in season, out of season? Does the exercise selection change? How do you change the set and reps to give enough room for rowing performance? All that stuff. Joe, do you want to start us off there?
Sure. So kind of depending on the individual or the group, the team, where they are. Let's just kind of assume that they've established and been able to, get through a full range of motion. They can do a goblet squat competently, get good ankle dorsiflexion. They're not changing spinal position, can maintain thoracic spine position, that type of thing. Check all those boxes off. So from there, going with single leg variations like the split squat or a lunge, and then progressing to doing something like a asymmetrical front squat with a kettlebell, or eventually double front squat, those types of variations. In terms of sets and reps, I've gone back and forth between kind of the Mike Boyle rep scheme of 8, 10, 12, week 1, 2, 3. And then, you're trying to either go up in reps or add a little bit of weight each week, or kind of strong first model of keeping it at the 3 to 5 rep range, and you're going heavy. But it really depends on, the athletes and kind of where they are. So it's a very sort of individual thing. In terms of off season, just focusing more on addressing asymmetries, imbalances, and really good movement competency. And then as they progress closer to racing season, the focus on developing max end strength and power and explosiveness takes precedent.
I was not aware that Mike Boyle had his own patented rep scheme.
I don't know if it's patented or not. Blake will probably be able to speak a little bit more, because he's probably much more familiar with his system. But having read the book, I know kind of the progression.
Blake, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mike would be the first to say that he's stolen and borrowed from a lot of people. So I don't think he would claim anything, but he definitely has a system.
No coach has ever made anything up in the history of coaching. That's the perception I've gotten.
Yeah, absolutely. But he definitely has a system and strategy for sure, which a lot of people do follow. And I follow a similar variation. I just tweak it a little bit, but I start with isometrics. So my first phase is always isometrics. I think it's really easy to teach. It's really safe. Safe to kind of get the people into the position. So
go and throw a definition of that out there, or an example of concretely what you're doing.
Yeah, so like having them hold the movement where I'd like them to hold it, and just create tension there and make sure they're in a good, stable, strong position. So if I use the goblet squat as an example, I'd have them come to the bottom of the goblet squat, make sure the arches are in a strong position, make sure the knees are out, make sure the chest is tall. And then I'd have them create tension in that movement by splitting the earth apart with their feet, maybe dialing the feet into the ground.
Do you load that too?
So I'll start unloaded, and then we'll load it if it's too easy and if they can do it well.
Cool. How long are you holding these for?
So with squats and deadlifts, I just do 5 seconds at the bottom, 5 seconds at the top. Otherwise, you start to get dizzy. So you don't want to hold those too long. And
so then, really full tension, not like a wall sit kind of endurance style.
Right, like basically like a hard style plank, like really make yourself shake almost.
Cool.
Yeah, so I'll start there, and then I'll do the Mike Boyle 8, 10, 12. And then the next phase, I'll pair 8, 10s, and 12s with isos. So building in endurance, a little bit more volume, but in a safe manner. And then I'll go into strength work, lower reps, like 5s, 3s, 5, 3, 1. And then I'll finish with power. So squat example would be like a goblet squat paired with squat jumps.
Cool. That's interesting to see the pairing kind of model there. That's not something that I've seen a lot done elsewhere. I think one of the things that many people in our audience right now are probably somewhat shocked by is the lack of super high reps. And I'm certainly not going to go against the grain there. I don't think we go over 12 reps really any point in the season. My overall kind of programming idea is to use the weight room for developing strength and power, really like the top end output, and do all of your endurance work in a sport specific way on the erg, on the water. If you're rowing and erging at a kind of normal rower workload, you're getting thousands of reps every week in a sport specific pattern of endurance. You're developing leg endurance plenty already. I do not use the weight room for developing really endurance beyond that in terms of what I think is a large part of the traditional kind of rowing strength training that we're trying to work against is that really high rep body weight circuits, or you're doing 50, 60, 100 jump squats or circuits of machines kind of thing. So like you guys, same thing. The bulk of my focus is on that 3 to 10 rep range to really try to develop top end strength and power to then carry over on the water, work your endurance.
Yeah, I totally agree. I never do over 12 reps. And I feel like and some studies have shown that like athletes get injured in the weight room. Most of the time it's doing higher volume stuff like that, where it's like you don't need all that volume. You're already getting it in your sport. It'd be much more safe to cut it down and actually work on a quality that you're not getting from your sport.
Yeah, I think that's a common misconception too, that the higher load is the dangerous side. I found the same thing, that the higher rep is the more dangerous side, because it's a lot harder to maintain mental focus on good technique, proper core bracing, safe execution of the lift through a set of 20 or 25 reps than it is through a set of 2 or 3 reps. You're talking about 20 seconds of focus maybe on a set of 2 or 3, maybe more like 10 seconds compared to, up to a minute of focus on the other ones. The movement, the technique, the movement quality starts to suffer. And then even if it's not, an acute dramatic injury, like, oh, wow, that guy failed a max squat and fell with it. That's like the acute, very dramatic, kind of like we all know that can be an injury risk. That shouldn't really happen in a weight room much. But the chronic stuff from the lower load training, that's what tends to build up more.
Yeah, and the quality is typically lower too, because the emphasis is on just making the athlete tired, right? Like I want him to be exhausted by the end, otherwise it's not a good workout. And that's not how it is. Like a lot of people think you need to be sore after a workout for it to be good. That's also not true. Like your body's still adapting. And that's something that we need to move past.
Yeah, I think you both just hit on super important area there. So many points that you both just made. The higher rep scheme. When you get up there and you're getting to a point of fatigue, technique, is going out of the window, and you can just enter basically, fight or flight mode. The nervous system will take over, and you're trying to get through the set instead of focusing on technical competence. All the points you made about building endurance through the sport, the strength training is a complement to the sport, focusing on injury prevention and then in performance enhancement. So training heavier and trying to teach the athlete to increase or generate more force production is one of those goals, and that's going to translate hopefully over to them being able to do better force production into the foot plate on the erg and in the boat.
Well, I think that's even a good way that you just phrased that, is that the role of strength training is to complement, not simulate sport training, right? We're not trying to recreate rowing training in the weight room. We're trying to do a specific thing in the weight room that's going to then benefit your rowing training down the road, not exactly simulate it.
100%. You got it. Absolutely.
And that's the other thing I loved about the rowers and the coaches who have been doing the 25 to 50 rep circuits is, okay, if you're doing that for sport endurance, then you're not really even doing enough, right? Like that's not the right answer. We don't want people to be doing more, but if a 2,000 meter race takes somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 225 strokes, I don't think that a set of 25 is actually developing sport specific endurance anyway, because you're still 175 to 200 reps short of your sport goal. So you're not even really doing a good job of developing sport specific endurance. So don't worry about that. Do your sport specific endurance sport specifically, and then use the weight room to build that top end power. We're coming right up on the end of our time here. So why don't we go around the horn one more time? Give us any final thoughts on the squat, or any, big takeaways that you would like the audience to walk away from today. Sorry.
Okay, I'll start off real quick.
Joe first. Yeah, go.
Okay. So I think we all did a great job covering. The only thing I mentioned that's maybe slightly new, or just going a little bit deeper real quick, is Blake mentioned kind of holding the bottom of the squat. So one other thing that you can do in programming, it's another variable to manipulate besides the weight or sets and reps, is the tempo. And we didn't go a ton over this, but
that's definitely a good thing to add in here.
Yeah, Cal Dietz does a ton in triphasic training. So, you have the three portions, the eccentric, concentric, and the isometric. So with the squat, you're standing at the top position, you're lowering down at the bottom, that's the isometric position, and then standing back up. So working on tempo, you can gain a lot of strength. So manipulating the variables. So maybe, for a month, you're standing 5 seconds at the top, pausing 1 second at the bottom in the hole, and then coming up and only spending 2 seconds at the top. And then you can switch that around. So maybe the next month you're spending 5 seconds in the bottom position, ton of time under load and tension, and then you're working on being very explosive out of the hole, right? So those are all things you can manipulate there that have, a lot of different performance enhancement qualities and gains in strength.
Nice. Great points. Blake, what you got?
Yeah, I mean, with anything, I would say, grab a mirror, grab a trainer, grab a coach, have them look at how you're moving, make sure that you're doing it well. And then from there, just be very progressive and safe with it. Because the last thing you want to do is lose days on the water. So, I mean, a lot of people that I see can just benefit from making their body weight squat better. It doesn't necessarily need to mean that they're doing a 225-pound front squat. So figure out where you are and then progressively work from there, and it will help in the end.
Cool. Then my kind of summary or big takeaway would be to have some approach to periodizing your training, or periodizing, just organizing your training in some way. So for me, starting from the furthest season away from competition. So for my spring 2K rowers, this means the summer, right? Because we've got then summer, fall, winter, and spring. So summer's the furthest one away. We're using a lot of variety, really trying to work on fixing the asymmetries, just like Joe mentioned, putting a lot of work into that, and then gradually tapering down the volume to make more room for more intense rowing training, bringing up the load to start to develop that top end power and maximum output of the legs, and then also tapering down the exercise selections so that we're kind of getting more and more specific through the whole year. I think that's a big approach that a lot of people can benefit from more, is that it's not possible to be in peak 6K performance all year and peak 2K performance all year and peak squat max performance all year. There's got to be some system for organizing your training as you develop in the sport. So that goes for your rowing training, just like it goes for your strength training, just like it goes for your squatting. So having some way to organize your training around that. Thank you guys for your time and your thoughts on the squat. For our audience, I hope that was a helpful discussion for you. Do please check us out. We'll be posting the show notes later today or tomorrow on Row Perfect. We'll get all these video links in and helpful exercise demonstrations. And then join us on that Facebook page too. We'll be having a discussion about this episode. So any questions that you have about it, we would love to answer them. So thanks very much, and we'll talk to you next time.